This is Kurt Harland Larson of Information Society, and you are listening to the Nothing Shocking podcast.
Want to know what's going on in the world of music? Then tune in to the Nothing Shocking podcast, a non-genre based, all ages friendly rock and roll program. Join us weekly for interviews with all your favorite rock stars from the mainstream to the underground. You can find us at nothingshocking.libsyn.com or anywhere you download podcasts.
We're putting the band back together.
The numbers all go to 11.
I'm talking about bands that rock. Led Zeppelin. What about Sabbath? AC/DC. Motorhead.
Does that mean it's louder? Is it any louder?
Well, it's one louder, isn't it?
We're not worthy! We're not worthy!
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
I get up off the ground and raise my head. Days like this, think I should be dead. One for Satan, two for me. Let's cheat the devil, it's fun, don't you agree?
Welcome to the Nothing Shocking podcast. I'm your co-host, Jeff Untied, and with me in Dog Bowl Studios is
Coach Nez.
You can find the Nothing Shocking podcast on Libsyn or any podcatchers. Like our Facebook page or follow us on Twitter at NoShockPod.
You can also find the Nothing Shocking podcast on Rock Rage Radio every Sunday morning at 7 a.m. Central Time. Our sponsor is Ragged Records, located in downtown Rock Island, Illinois, and downtown Davenport, Iowa. We'd like to thank the Hong Kong Sleepover for allowing us to use their music for our intro and bumper ending. Tonight's guest is
Kurt Harland of Information Society.
Yeah, they don't have any new material out right now, but their last release was in 2021, the Information Society album titled Oddfellows.
Yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, fantastic album. Kurt, what else does he do?
Music soundtracks for video games.
Yeah, so he's still active in the music world.
I mean, I remember the song Pure Energy, but I was thrilled to find out they were from the Midwest originally. I didn't know that.
Yeah, Minnesota boys. So,
all right.
Hey, let's get to that interview.
Good night.
Good night. Kurt, welcome to the Nothing Shocking podcast. I'd like to introduce you, my co-host, Jeff Untied.
Kurt, thanks for joining us tonight.
Indeed. Hello.
Well, we are so excited to have you. Thank you for all the correspondence. We're ecstatic to have you as our guest tonight. And welcome to the Nothing Shocking podcast. In 2021, Information Society released the Oddfellows album. The band released the album during the pandemic, and the album kind of flew under the radar with a lot of us, not realizing that this album was released during the COVID pandemic. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about the writing, recording, and the creation process of this album?
Yeah, some years ago, like after we released Orders of Magnitude, I don't know how many people know, but we've put out 3 albums in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. We kind of felt that the realities of modern internet distribution and just internet stuff in general was such that it was more beneficial to release one song at a time on a regular schedule than to just disappear for years and then come out with an album and then disappear again. Right. So we started releasing one song at a time, and we did that with, I think, 3 or 4 songs, all of which are on Oddfellows. But then we kind of chickened out. You know, we're old and we're used to how things used to be, so we all got anxious about not having an album and kind of unhappy about the fact that you can garner more interest with an album than you can with a single, so we kind of chickened out on that visionary new method and went back to releasing an album instead, which means that now we have nothing.
Well, so we've interviewed many artists that have felt like the COVID pandemic, with everything being under lockdown, that it gave them a renaissance in creativity as far as writing goes. Did you and the rest of the band feel as though that you had a writing renaissance to your music during the COVID pandemic lockdown, or was it just kind of like status quo for you guys as usual?
It didn't really affect us. I mean, we already didn't live in the same town and hadn't for a long time. The way we did recording wasn't really affected by it. Paul will have an idea for a song and he wants me to do vocals, or maybe he wants me to add lyrics and melody and vocals. So I'll figure that out at home, and then we get together and record, either in Minneapolis or before that it was Los Angeles. And none of that really changed. If we had been, if this had been 1989, when we were all focused on doing the band and like nothing else, and everything was about rehearsing together and touring together, etc., that would have been pretty disruptive. So I imagine that for a lot of bands who are kind of in their heyday or just getting started and doing a lot of touring in 2020, it would have been a real blow to their inertia, their momentum. But we were already in such a kind of laid-back hobby mode that it didn't have much effect. This hasn't been our day job for decades.
You kind of mentioned that you were releasing singles at a time prior to deciding to make it an album, but how many songs do you guys typically record towards an album before you decide to narrow it down?
Well, again, we're old, so we, our understandings were formed in the 20th century, and I think we'd be embarrassed to put out an album that had less than 8 songs on it. And anything more than 10 we consider to be extra credit.
Yeah.
So as long as we have something in that range of songs to release, we're fine with it.
I wanted to bring this back to Oddfellows. Room 1904 is my favorite track on that album. Can you talk a little bit more? Can you talk a little bit more about the creation of that song? Is there a story behind it?
Yeah. Paul has a business doing music for advertising, which he's done for over 25 years. And there was a track, when you do music for advertising, you frequently make a song, like you put all the work into making the song and recording it, and you give it to the client, and the client says, nah, no thanks, and that's it. So they have a lot of stuff laying around that they made but never got used. So sometimes they'll just take it out and use it as is. Sometimes they'll take it out and sort of change it a little. And this was one of those. He pulled out something that he had been working on for an ad, and started from there and worked it more in the direction of the band and Information Society songs. And then he sent it to me as just an instrumental and said, do you want to come up with melody and lyrics for this one? Which I did, and there you have it.
Simple enough.
Yeah.
You kind of alluded to this previously. Talk about releasing singles at a time. It seems like, opposed to releasing an album, but it seems like, the day of, with releasing music on Spotify and any other avenue that there is, there's thousands of songs being released every day on Spotify or whatever source you're going to get your music from. But anyway, it feels like we're kind of going in reverse. It feels like we're in the 50s again, where bands are releasing 45s, except everything's on the internet now. We also see more artists releasing EPs now, opposed to never releasing an EP ever. Are you in the rest of the band? Is your mindset still releasing the full length album, to this day forward, or will you guys ever go to that EP format, or will you guys ever just go to singles only sometime in the future?
I have no idea. We don't really have any plans. If you've seen Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, towards the end, when the guy's driving the truck on the railroad tracks, he says, "Plan? There ain't no plan."
Fair enough.
I mean, the only reason we switched to doing singles only is because I got a bee in my bonnet about that, and then the only reason we switched back is because we were just thought, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. So, I don't even know if we'll release another album again ever.
Well, let's hope that we.
We just rediscovered you again. I want to hear more.
Jeff, you got the next one?
Well, I was just going to talk about Down in Flames a little bit. Another song that I liked. Do you have anything about the making of that song?
That one's interesting in that it was a very old song. apologies if to Paul if I am remembering this incorrectly, but I'm pretty sure what happened on that was that Paul was looking through a bunch of his really old songs from back when we were doing the Peace and Love Incorporated album.
Yeah.
And thinking, I bet there's some songs in here that are still good and we could like update them and release them. And he mentioned that to me, and I said, well, I always really liked Down in Flames, so if we do that, let's try that one. So he made a new version of it, and I sang on it at the end.
Awesome.
That's it, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a almost 30-year-old song by the time we released it last year.
Well, I guess that spawns another question. You said that who knows if you'll ever make another album again. But as far as unreleased Information Society music, how much stuff do you guys have in the vault? Do you have plenty of
Not
music?
much.
Really?
No, I mean, we've put out a bunch of stuff already of like obscure, weird, sucky tracks that we never even polished or anything. We've done that more than once already. The stuff that hasn't been released is like, not really worth listening to for the most part. It's not like we have a bunch of polished, well-done, fully fledged songs sitting around that we just decided not to release at some point.
Oh, bummer.
If your listeners look up a product called Insoc Apocryphon, you'll find it's got a bunch of tracks that are old and obscure, and we pretty much shot all of our ammunition on that.
Yeah, very good. Jeff, you got the next one?
Well, yeah, you kind of alluded to orders of magnitude. The previous album before that, 2016, was a covers album of sorts. A lot of tributes to Gary Newman, Heaven 17, Sisters of Mercy, Devo. Can you talk a little bit about?
We did a Gary Newman song?
Yeah,
No, we didn't.
well,
What are you talking about?
Praying to the Aliens?
Oh, yeah. Forgot about that.
Well, it said it was written by Gary Newman. But...
Well, I mean, other people always know more about our music than I do. That's nothing new.
Well, I guess can you talk a little bit about the influences those bands had on you for maybe picking some of those tracks?
I don't know. I mean, we get asked that influences question, regularly, and we've been asked it for 40 years, and I never really know what to say. I mean, like what bands I liked in the early days. There were bands that were my favorite, right? Like Pink Floyd or B-52s, but they're not really much of influences. And then there were bands that were heavy influences that I liked only somewhat, like Deutsche Amerikanische Freundschaft. But I think that in the early days, the biggest influences on the music that we made in the band would have been Devo and DAF, which I just mentioned, and Yellow, and some of the early experimental synth punk stuff like Suicide, even that Warm Leatherette song by I forgot who.
Oh, very good.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
But certainly Gary Newman and Devo were way up there. And more like people we were sort of emulating as opposed to influenced, if you know what I mean.
Very much so. 2014, the band released Hello World. Can you talk a little bit more about that album's release?
Yeah, well, that was the first album in quite a while. I can't remember when Synthesizer came out, but I think it was 06, maybe. So that was after an 8-year break, and that itself was after an 8 or 9 year break after Don't Be Afraid. We pretty much stopped doing anything with the band at all from 98 to 04, and then Paul wanted to start it up again when I wasn't really available, so I didn't really get back into doing stuff with it until probably 06 or something. But so then we went another 8 years without releasing an album. We were just kind of touring on the old stuff, which was fine with us. And I don't remember what I think. Paul just had a feeling that he wanted to do an album again, so we did. When you don't care about your career as a band and you're not trying to develop it and you're not depending on it for income, the way things happen is very sort of organic and accidental. You don't develop plans or try to make things happen or have an agenda or figure things out. You just one day say, well, we have 7 songs. If we did 3 more, we could have an album. Yeah, I suppose. And that's about it,
Well, fair enough. I guess that would lead into the next question: is if you could compare and contrast the band's writing style to that of in the band's infancy, do you feel as though the band's writing and recording matured along the way, or was it just kind of like business as usual for you guys from the get-go?
You mean the method or the
methodology.
musical style of the results?
I think it was more like your methodology.
Yeah, there's some change. Early on, it was really kind of just Paul writing songs, and then like when we first started the band, he already had a collection of songs before I even knew what he was doing, and it took me a long time to ramp up to writing songs while he was already going with it when we first started. So most of the songs before our first album came out were just Paul making songs, and then I would sing them. And then I started to get into writing, but I was always doing like one song for every 8 that Paul made. But I really wanted to learn how to record music myself, which I did. So I had, but I was also contributing to lyrics a fair amount back then. I'm just trying to remember all this stuff. It's like 35 years ago.
Yeah.
So we worked fairly separately. He would create a complete song with demo tracks that already had all the lyrics done and the melody set, and I would do the same, and we would just pick songs to go on the albums, and that was it. Then Paul quit the band in '93, and I did one album all by myself called Don't Be Afraid, and that was just me doing everything. Mm-hmm. Then Paul pretty much did everything on the synthesizer album because I told him I wasn't really available when he wanted to start doing stuff again at first. Then later I joined in. So then he did pretty much everything on that one. But that since then, we sort of settled into a routine where half the songs Paul would just make them complete, and half of them he would give them to me for lyrics and or melody. And then I'd just record vocals for him.
Oh, very good.
Growing up in the Midwest, not actually too far from Minneapolis, I remember in college, First Avenue was always a legendary place that we always wanted to go visit. Can you talk a little bit about, Information Society has a star on the side of the wall for First Avenue. Can you talk about that venue?
Yeah, I wish I knew when First Avenue began their star wall, because I'm pretty sure it was after we moved away. Summer of 2000.
Oh, wow.
Right, so that was 12 years after we moved away. I have to assume that these stars represent people who have played at the venue. I mean, it doesn't specifically say that anywhere, but if that isn't it, then it's just a list of musical artists, and that seems kind of pointless. So, the First Avenue was sort of, at the time we didn't call it, that one club called First Avenue. We just called it the club. It was really the only one.
Yeah.
There were a few other venues, but they were basically small bars. And First Avenue was an actual venue. You could have mid-size acts come through there. They couldn't have had Van Halen. They weren't big enough for that. Mm-hmm. But they were big enough to have, at the time, they were big enough to have acts like Bow Wow Wow and Wall of Voodoo and all the other things you see on here, I mean, supposedly including Aerosmith, although I find that that must have been like a unannounced performance or something. Sure. Psychedelic Furs was sort of perfect size for First Avenue. Mm. And but the interesting thing about that club, and I think this was a really important part of the early Minneapolis music scene history, is the name of the club is First Avenue and the 7th Street entry, which means there was another small door over on 7th Street instead of the main door on First Avenue, and it led into a small space with its own stage and its own sound system. Mm. And this was a place where new bands would play, like bands that literally had never played before, for example. And the people running the club, Chrissy Dunlap and Steve McClellan, they seemed to really enjoy, being people who could bring completely unheard of bands from the city onto a stage and do these shows for 7 people in the audience and stuff, but it became this kind of scene, and people loved it. So we played there, God, I don't know how many times, probably at least 15. And then in the big room on the big stage, like several times. All of this before, we even got known outside of Minneapolis. So it was a really important part of our development. There just weren't any other viable venues to speak of. We played one show at a bar called Duff's and another show at a bar called Duffy's, and everything else was at First Avenue, 7th Street entry. I think it was an important place because of what I was just saying. The people managing it were trying to help, provide something to help develop local bands that were just starting out, and that made it a really interesting place.
Fantastic.
Well, you said you might not make any more albums anymore, but how about your live shows? Are you guys still out doing tours or one-offs, or how's it work for you guys?
One-offs, yeah. I mean, none of us would be willing to do an actual tour at this point, but we do one-offs. I'd say regularly, but not often. We have 2 shows coming up in Toronto next month, and we're doing a convention in Chicago, and we go to Brazil. Now that the pandemic's subsided somewhat, we went back to Brazil for the first time in a few years in January. But we usually don't do more than 4 to 6 trips per year, and that's usually just either one show or as many as 3 or 4. That's it.
We see a lot of bands, more heritage acts more than ever now, are doing those weekend warrior flyout dates type of thing. Is that ever going to where they jump in a plane on a Thursday and they go play a Friday, Saturday show, and then they fly back home, and then they get all ready and they do it all over again, fly it on a Thursday night. And it's just a repetitive thing, like throughout the summertime or spring.
We've been doing that since 1985. That's basically been our whole method since then.
Oh, well.
We only had, honest to God, proper tours, where you have 25 shows in 31 days or something. We only did that a couple of times when we were in our heyday, with an actual tour bus and stuff. And we did it once or twice in Brazil in the 90s, but that's it. And generally, we've always just been flying out to places to do a small number of shows, as small as one.
You guys have been revolutionary in that tour methodology before it was an actual thing.
Yeah,
I doubt we influenced anyone. I think it's just that we had a strange situation going where, we were a new wavy synth pop band from Minneapolis who bizarrely got picked up by the Latin dance scenes in New York and Miami, and their tradition for performances was usually to have one singer with one microphone do one song. That was how shows were typically done in that scene, because the people enjoyed just being at the dance club for a while, and then there'd be a special event where one person would sing one song, usually a song that's played at the club a lot, and then you just go back to dancing. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to a concert, So we would show up with instruments and keyboard stands and stuff, and 5 people, and the people who ran the clubs were kind of like, why do you have all this junk? This is hard.
Well, as we look at the discography of Information Society from its inception until the current time, do you have an album that is your favorite and that's the best interpretation of the band? And then do you have an album? Do you have another album that you feel like is maybe you wish you could have a redo and re-record it all over again?
Well, I'm not going to say anything bad about any of our albums just because, the majority of it is Paul's work, and I'm not going to publicly speak negatively of a colleague. But I have been saying to people quite a lot in recent years that I think our last 3 albums are the best work we've ever done. Of course, I think that's true for a lot of bands. If you look at Ultravox, for example, they put out an album around 2010 or so called Brilliant, and it was just brilliant. It sounded, and it wasn't just that it was good. It sounded like an Ultravox album, right? It totally could have just slipped right in there between Vienna and Rage in Eden, and you would have thought, oh, except for the production values sounding kind of modern, this totally fits their original oeuvre. And some of the Human League albums in the last 20 years, I think have been better than anything they did in the 80s too. The problem is, though, that I don't think that the music listening public thinks about this consciously too much, but there's much more involved in someone forming an emotional bond with the music of a band than just, is the music good or not?
Yeah.
That's fairly far down the list. What it's mostly about is emotional memory associations cooked over time. If you heard a song 1,000 times when you were in college, then 25 years later, it doesn't matter if you even liked that song, it's gonna have an effect on you, and you're going to put a certain amount of value on that because, like Proust's Madeleines, it creates a full existence memory experience for you. And something similar to that is what people really value about bands who have been playing for decades, which is why it's really hard for those bands to get interest going in their new material, right? If you go to see Human League, there's diehard fans who are going to know, all the songs from Credo, but everyone's going to want to hear "Don't You Want Me, Baby."
Exactly.
Even though I would personally rather hear "The Black Hit of Space," but it's 8% of your fans are going to be deep cut fans, and 3% of them are going to be recent material fans, and everyone else is going to want to be brought back to that experience they had in the past. And I want to hear the songs I know. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But it does make it difficult for artists to continue developing over time. Like, imagine if you went to a Psychedelic Furs song and they didn't play "Love My Way." Like, well, maybe they don't want to play that one anymore, right?
Exactly.
Or it's like when a band takes their a hit or their hits and then reworks them into a new style. Everybody freaks out.
Yeah, and we've done some of that on stage, but we don't really have much motivation to release different versions of old songs. So your question was, looking back in the albums, what do I think about them? The recent ones are really the ones I'm most proud of, especially Oddfellows. And Orders of Magnitude is just super fun if you already knew and liked all of those songs, like I did. And as far as ones that I'm not that into in hindsight, I mean, I think Hack was a strategically bungled album. I think Hack has some of our best songs, and it has some of our worst songs. We were still really young at that time, mid-20s, and nobody had yet explained to us what we eventually learned, which is that variety is a terrible thing on an album. There's this weird assumption artists make that, like, having a bunch of songs that are very, very, very different from each other on one album is somehow a good thing, and it's not. It's terrible. You're tempted to think, well, there's something on here for everybody to like, but that's not how people work. The way they work is there's something on here for everyone to hate. If there's one song on that piece of vinyl, that you can't mix into a playlist because it's on vinyl, or, God forbid, cassette tape, that you don't like, that's probably going to be enough to make you not play the record. Whereas if there's only one song that you do like, that's not going to be enough to make you play it. So whereas the first album, all the songs kind of hung together fairly well. I mean, they could have been more, I think they could have been more stylistically unified, but they're similar enough. With their second album, Hack, we just kind of went in 9 different directions at once, and I think the resulting collection of songs was a sort of jarring experience where no matter what mood you were in, there's going to be something on that album that you wouldn't want to hear at that moment.
Fair enough.
So the one thing I would redo is go back and pick a fucking style, guys, and just go with that on that album, Dump out half the songs, do the other half. I don't even care which half,
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah. We haven't really had a chance to talk about your video game work. You do music for video games. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how you got started in that?
Yeah, well, I'll make a confession. I've been actually doing it while we've been talking.
Nice.
I mean, while we've been talking, I've been moving animation tags around to trigger sounds at the right times to match up with the motion of some stuff in the game. So that's an ongoing thing for me.
That's cool.
I started in the mid-'90s. I had just God, what is that? In '93, Paul said, I just got married and we're having a kid, and I think I want to go back to school, and our record label dropped us, so I think I'm just going to quit. You can keep doing it if you want. So I did for a while, but the first thing I did is I moved to San Francisco and started trying to get into the games industry because I knew that the band was not going to reliably pay my rent going forward.
Yeah.
So I started doing sound and music for video games in '94. And got my first in-house job in '98 at a company called Crystal Dynamics, which is still going. I worked at Electronic Arts, a place called Gazillion, a place which is out of business, a place called Nihilistic, which is out of business, a couple others, most recently at Machine Zone. And I started out mostly doing music and then transitioned out of that and mostly actually working on the game team as one of the game developers in the audio department rather than someone who composed music at home and sent it into the company. Which I just didn't want to do. I wanted to be on the team,
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Well, I have one last question for you. We always kind of end this interview with the same question to every artist, but the mystery of rock and roll has been kind of let out of the bag with the dawning of the internet and social media. And we've talked to many artists that have mixed emotions about this, but for you, the artist, the fan, what do you prefer? Do you miss the mystery of rock and roll, or do you like this dawning of accessibility? Because if we didn't have the internet, we wouldn't be able to do this with you tonight. So where's your mind at when it comes to this?
Well, you're talking about the changes in the ecosystem of popular music brought about by the internet?
Yes.
There's a lot to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that speaks most directly to the way you phrased it is that if you bring down the barriers to entry, there's a lot of good things that happen and a lot of bad things that happen. And everybody knew that they were going to happen. It wasn't a surprise. It's no surprise that if the barriers to entry fall, that you're going to be flooded with a bunch of cheap crap. But as we had hoped, it also means that a lot of people who can and do make really great stuff are going to be able to do it, and people are going to be able to hear it, whereas before they probably wouldn't have, because such and such person would simply not have been able to garner the support and the money and the corporate attention to even, have vinyl discs printed. Now, when it's a matter of, having a laptop and knowing how to upload a file to a server, well, like I said, you get both. You get so much crap that you need intermediaries just to sift through it for you and curate it for you, which we always did before, but now even more so. But we also get stuff that just could never have been made in, say, 1975.
Yeah.
An artist could make the music, but there's no way that people would have been able to hear it.
Right.
So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
One other really substantial change that most listeners probably don't think about too much is there's been a complete reversal in what your job is if you're in a band.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that there are far fewer jobs available for people whose job is to be in a band. It's much, much, much harder to make a living off being a music artist now than it was 30 years ago. But there's basically two jobs. There's getting your recordings of your music out to people, either in return for money or not, and live performances.
Yeah.
And 30 years ago and 40 years ago, the whole way that worked was that the recordings were what was most important. Your most important money came from the sale of those discs, and you did live shows in order to promote and increase sales of those discs. Mm-hmm. Most bands didn't expect to make a lot of profit from playing shows. Some did, but you had to be sort of above a certain level before you would really make significant money, and enough to live on just from doing shows. It was mostly seen as advertising, as a promotional tool. So that's why there was a thing called tour support from record labels. They would just give you money to pay for you to go on tour, because chances are you couldn't even pay for the tour with the amount of money that you would make playing shows. Now it's exactly the reverse. Now publish music in order to legitimize your live show, and it's your live show where you're going to make money if you ever do. I would hate to be a new band starting it now and thinking that it has to make me money. I can't fucking imagine how frustrating and disappointing that would be.
Yeah.
Most people who make any money at all from internet streaming play are either super ultra megastars, or they're people who have a long, long, long history behind them before streaming became a thing, like we do. And we don't make much, right? Like, and all the streaming stuff combined in a year for me is like less than $10,000. So it really is all about the live show now. And that's another big change that I've seen, is that inversion of selling albums versus touring. It's become very, very difficult to make money by selling recordings of your music to people. Like, people buy a recording of your music. It's totally going away. The people who distribute music are very much wanting to move to a model where nobody owns their own music. You just pay to have access to the library that the company maintains.
Yeah.
Or, and then Spotify works it out with the suppliers, and then you just go to Spotify or something like that. But I'm showing my age here when I point out that, all the albums I've ever had, I now have, ripped and digitized on my computer. Anytime I want to listen to music, I go to the folder on my computer and I play the music I want to play. I have the files myself, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to worry if YouTube or somebody decides, or Apple Music decides, we don't want to sell this artist's music anymore, right? Because I have it. But I realize that when I say stuff like that, I sound like some old guy going, "Oh, well, nobody's riding horses anymore. God damn it! These newfangled automobiles making so much noise." But I'm always going to want to own my own copies of my music.
Yeah, that's how Eric and I are.
Yeah, absolutely. We're out of our allotted time for the evening. Is there anything that we left off tonight that you would like to cover or plug or promote?
Yeah, just everyone should think about climate disruption as the issue of your lifetimes. I'm continuingly appalled that people somehow imagine that things like, the presidential election or celebrities or the economy or God knows what is somehow in the same class of importance as climate disruption. That we're talking about civilization-ending Armageddon shit. Mm-hmm. And nothing that you think is important is as important as that. So Please put your attention and efforts there.
You couldn't be more spot on. Last week, actually a week ago from today, we had an EF tornado came through our area, just decimated some areas. And I'm going to tell you, 20 years ago, I've lived in this area for 20 years, and since we've bought this house 20 years ago, we've had more climate disruptions with straight line winds and basically derechos, and now a tornado. Back when I was a kid and lived in this area, the most you would get was a thunderstorm and knock the power out for an hour or two. And now we're getting tornadoes.
Where are you?
Rock Island, Illinois. Quad Cities, Davenport, Iowa, on the Mississippi River.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I mean, we're decimated. So you couldn't be more spot on.
Yeah. Our ski resort was only open 10 days.
Yeah.
If you put more heat energy into the atmosphere, you're going to have more energetic atmospheric events.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is how things are going to work out. We're about 2 to 3 weeks behind our scheduled episodes. So probably about 3 weeks after Jeff gets this episode all polished and cleaned up, I'll send it to you immediately. Please share it wherever you can. We'd appreciate it.
Yeah, send me a link, and I'll put it on our band Facebook page.
Hey, you were fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch with you in about 3 weeks.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, great. Bye, guys.
Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.